I want to speak tonight about my book, Ratification, but even more about the subject. And I will say it's a little awesome not only to speak to the members of the Society of the Cincinnati and their families, but to sit under the portrait to speak under the portrait of the man who's was the focus of the prologue to the book and whose correspondence about the ratification process gives a thread throughout my narrative. I think of it as Washington's correspondence as the string that holds the beads of my story together. And so it's a tremendous honor, as I've already said, but I'll embellish that perception a bit, but that comment. I trust you like what I say, sir. The surprising thing about my book, I suppose, is maybe the most surprising thing about it, is that it is the first narrative history of the ratification of the Constitution. That is the first book that the substance of which begins on September 17, 1787, when the Federal Convention adjourned, and goes through September 13, 1788, when the Confederation Congress formally declared the Constitution ratified. And in that year, in state after state, specially elected popular conventions met, and it was there that the fate of the Constitution was decided. The first book, I mean, this is the critical year in our history. It links our feeble national origins in the 1780s. It doesn't link. It stands between our feeble national origins and everything the country became later, the strength, the international respectability that it accomplished, and which I think in some measure we are struggling to maintain. The first book, compare it to the studies of the Federal Convention. We have shelves of those books. Some of them have appendices or a final chapter on ratification. They click off, first Delaware, then Pennsylvania, then New Jersey, etc. But at the end of the book, it's as if, it's as if it were the afterthought. It's as if the real story happened in Philadelphia when the Constitution was written, and that its ratification was a no-brainer and therefore a non-story. I suspect that that attitude comes from the reverence for the Constitution that set in very rapidly once it was ratified, but nothing could be more misleading for the period immediate before that happened. And how could it? Let me give you a couple of facts, and you'll see why this had to be a very controversial period in our history. First of all, the convention that wrote the Constitution had no authorization to do that. It had been appointed for the sole and exclusive purpose of proposing amendments to the Articles of Confederation, such as would make the government sufficient for the exigencies of our affairs. Instead, it met in secret for 4 months and then said, hey, if we got an idea for you, chuck the Confederation and we've got a better idea. How could it do that? I mean, totally unauthorized. Well, they wrote a letter to explain this, and Mr. Washington signed it. It said there was no way they could give more power to the Confederation because all of those powers would be exercised through only one agency of government. That is, the Confederation had only a Congress. There was no executive judiciary. So before you granted more power for safety and security for the rights of the people, you had to redesign the government so power would be divided among the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. Yes, all very good. But for the moment, ladies and gentlemen, the institution which had most egregiously exceeded the grant of power to it was the Federal Convention itself. In a country that was sensitive about that kind of thing, that abuse of power would not have gone unnoticed. Second, to add to the problem, the Confederation took it upon itself, again, with no authority whatsoever, to tell the country how it should ratify the Constitution. Amendments to the Articles of Confederation required the consent of Congress and of all 13 state legislatures. Oh, no, the convention said, I keep saying, without any authority whatsoever. It said this time we should do it differently. It should be laid before Congress. Now, what do you suppose that meant? Even the Congress, when it got it, said, what the devil are we supposed to do with this? What it did mean is that they did not require Congress's approval. It should, that its fate would again be, the Constitution should be then forwarded to the state legislatures, not for them to decide what they thought about it, but to call elections for these state conventions. And then to add further to the outrage, the convention said that these conventions, who were the spokesmen of the sovereign people, could not propose, could not insist upon any changes to the Constitution. They had to take it or leave it. This was too much for George Mason, probably the leading constitutionalist in the country at that time. He said, it's really not nice to tell the sovereign people, take this or nothing. Edmund Randolph, who was more influential than anyone else in getting Mr. Washington, the retired general, I guess he kept it, we could still call him General Washington, can't we? Getting General Washington to attend the convention, said, if it's an up or down vote, it'll go down, and the country is in crisis. This is a terrible decision. For that reason, Mason, Randolph, and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts did not sign the Constitution. They stayed to the end of the convention and then did not sign it. Others just wandered away because they didn't like what the convention was doing, or for personal reasons, of course, in some instances. So, if the convention wasn't unanimous, you can well assume that the country would have been divided. And the truth is that the Constitution was anything but a no-brainer. This was one of the most divisive years in American history, one of the most controversial. Newspapers were full of debate over the Constitution. One New Englander said that the newspapers in that year were read more than the Bible. And in New England, that was saying something. People were debating it, we know, not just in the conventions, but in the streets, in taverns, in homes. And here I regret, I think, how often do you sit down and write out what happened in a debate in your living room or over your dining room table? I think the lack of records of those debates in people's homes is the reason we do not have many records of women's opinions being expressed in this story. One we do have, however, from of all places, Biddeford, Maine, and it turns out of the 4 participations in what sounds like a rollicking argument over the Constitution, of 4 participants, 3, including the provocateur, were women. Women were involved. We just don't have the sources to document it, I tell you.